Here's my take. Well into the second month of the US-Israeli war, it is worth taking stock of where things stand. Here's what things looked like in Iran and its neighborhood before the war began in late February. In June 2025, Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities had been, in President Trump's words, completely and totally obliterated by a 12-day bombing campaign by US and Israeli forces using American stealth bombers and 30,000-pound bunker-busting bombs. The head of Israel's defense forces agreed with Trump, saying, "We have set Iran's nuclear project back by years, and the same goes for its missile program." That conclusion was reiterated by Israel's Atomic Energy Commission, which added that the achievement can continue indefinitely as long as Iran did not get access to nuclear materials, and that access was actively being denied. Iran's military capabilities had been substantially weakened by separate Israeli air campaigns in 2024, which killed key Revolutionary Guard leaders, destroyed air defenses, and struck ballistic missile facilities. Israel also heavily bombed Iran's most deadly militia ally, Hezbollah, killing several layers of its top leadership and, by many analyses, crippling the military strength of the organization. It had already taken apart Hamas in Gaza. Finally, Israel's campaign against the Iran-backed militias that supported the Syrian government played a part in the collapse of that regime in December 2024. In other words, Iran was in very bad shape militarily. In addition, its economy was a mess, destroyed by the tightening of sanctions and its own corrupt regime. Hardly anyone could argue that Iran posed a threat to its neighbors, let alone to the United States, which sits roughly 6,000 miles away. Donald Trump effectively admitted this on Wednesday.
We don't have to be there, but we're there to help our allies.
It's worth noting that none of America's European or Asian allies were consulted, and many have spoken out against the war. In fact, reports suggest that Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu sold Trump on this war not because Iran was an imminent threat, but because its unprecedented weakness provided an opportunity to strike hard to effect regime change. Why else would Trump have closed his brief announcement at the start of the war by urging the Iranian people to rise up and overthrow the regime, a call echoed by Netanyahu in his own message? So far, aside from devastating Iran and crippling its already weak military, which was predictable in such a one-sided contest, few of the desired results have been achieved. The regime has not fallen. Key leaders have changed for the worse. The 86-year-old Ayatollah Khamenei, who famously banned the development of nuclear weapons, was killed and replaced by his son, who is said to be more hardline than his father. In general, the Revolutionary Guards, who have always been more militant, seem to be ascendant, which makes sense in times of war. The Strait of Hormuz, which was free and open despite many threats through 47 years of US-Iran tensions, is now blocked by the new leadership, whom Trump terms much more reasonable. President Trump says that after a few more bombing runs, the strait will open naturally because Iran will want to export its own oil. This misreads the situation. The strait is not closed. It is open to Iranian oil, which is flowing freely, especially to China. The net result of the war is that Iran now makes about twice as much on its daily oil sales compared to before the conflict. In addition, if it continues to charge a reported $2 million per passing ship, Tehran will make hundreds of millions of dollars in additional revenue every month, enough to rebuild its military and more. America's Gulf allies now face a far more unstable and tense environment than they did before the war. Their business models require peace, stability, and economic integration. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman had mended ties with Iran in 2023 because he wanted to calm geopolitical waters to pursue his ambitious program of modernization. Today, all that progress is in jeopardy as oil exports are crippled and the region has gone from having a path to be an oasis of stability rather than a cauldron of conflict. The obvious winner is Russia, which will make billions of extra dollars every month as the price of oil rises and America waves sanctions against it. Ukraine loses as weapons it needs are diverted to the Middle East. Europe loses as it faces crushing energy costs, and Trump demands that NATO fight his war and threatens to pull out of the organization if it doesn't. It's worth noting that NATO is a defensive alliance and did not fight in the wars in Korea, Vietnam, or Iraq. China gains as America gets mired in another Middle Eastern conflict and loses its focus on Asia. Meanwhile, Beijing's massive investments in green technology shield it from many of the costs of this war, and it appears to the world as a more responsible, less disruptive superpower. Of course, things could change. Wars are unpredictable. But so far, has any American military action ever racked up so many costs for so few gains? I'm joined by Richard Haass, the President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, and Zanny Minton-Beddoes, the Editor-in-Chief of The Economist. Richard, the American forces were able to do something extraordinary, really quite spectacular. But what the president is now asking them to do next appears to be to bomb the basic energy infrastructure, power plants that provide civilians with energy. That is traditionally been considered a war crime, and it certainly on plain reading is a violation of the Geneva Convention. What do you think of this idea, and is it possible U.S. military personnel who are told not to follow illegal orders might have some qualms about actually executing an order like this?
Well, several things there, Fareed. First of all, you're right. The rescue mission was operationally extraordinary, and it's consistent with this war, where the operational capabilities of the U.S. military have been phenomenal. But all that said, it doesn't necessarily mean the United States is winning the war strategically. There's a strong argument we are not. What you raise is the idea of going after infrastructure. I think it does raise fundamental legal questions, also raises real policy questions, because what Iran has shown is its willingness and ability to respond in kind against the water plants, the energy infrastructure of all of its neighbors. Whether individual soldiers would balk, I think that's unlikely, simply because there are those making the argument that because energy, for example, somehow contributes to military activities or leadership activities, my guess is it's in something of a gray area. But this is the responsibility of the commander-in-chief, and the kind of post that the president put out on Truth Social, which really raises fundamental questions about his judgment, and then urging these kinds of attacks. Again, I would think this does the opposite of reassuring our partners and allies, and I don't think it intimidates Iran.
Let me just read for those who have missed it. This is a Trump tweet that Richard is referencing. And it says, and I'm now quoting, and there is explicit language, but I am quoting the President of the United States. Tuesday will be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day, all wrapped up in one in Iran. There will be nothing like it. Open the fucking strait, you crazy bastards, or you'll be living in hell. Just watch. Praise be to Allah. Zanny, when you listen to this, the question I have in a way is the problem Trump seems to have found himself in is anything he does to punish Iran is almost certainly going to raise the price of oil, because Iran will respond to energy infrastructure in the Gulf, because they will keep the Strait of Hormuz closed, that is closed to non-Iranian oil. So it feels as though Trump has sort of backed himself into a corner, assuming the Iranians will absorb pain, which they seem willing to do.
Absolutely. I mean, the first thing to say is I was as shocked hearing you read that post as I was reading it myself. And it is, I mean, and I use this word advisedly, it sounds unhinged. That is the President of the United States is just profoundly shocking. And I think we've all become somewhat inured to statements by the President of the United States, but even by his standards, that was very shocking. And I wasn't surprised when I looked on my phone just a few minutes ago to find several people asking whether this was actually real. So I think, you know, let's just take a breath about the kind of language being used by the president. But yes, you're absolutely right. I think this is a mark of his frustration, and his frustration with a situation where Iran clearly has the upper hand in strategic terms, because he has no good options, President Trump. If he tries to escalate, it is likely that Iran, which has already shown that it will escalate itself, will damage more oil installations, the price of oil will go higher. If he somehow declares victory and moves away, then the straits are likely to stay closed. And so right now, this is a very, very difficult situation, and one where I think the President of the United States is showing us just how frustrated he is. But if those threats were to be carried out, I don't for a second think that it would do anything other than increase Iran's resolve to maintain the straits being closed.